Good afternoon and welcome to the Washington Institute. I'm Rob Satloff, the Executive Director, and I'm delighted to see all of you here today. I think the interest in foreign policy in the wake of our presidential election is certainly evident by the standing room only crowd that we have here today. We are now already into the process of transition. Transition even with the same president. Transitions are the most fluid and receptive moments in the presidential cycle to have an impact on the policy process. And so I take it as a good sign that there's so much interest in the foreign policy process by your presence here today. Now, I think that the transition from a first to a second Obama administration may, of course, begin the day after an election, but it doesn't end on Inauguration Day. This process is going to continue for some time as the president's new or old team takes shape and, where necessary, seeks confirmation, as the new old team goes through the inevitable period of reassessment and redefinition of priorities and opportunities, and as other issues, domestic issues, the fiscal cliff, for example, impacts foreign policy. And let's not forget, as the world recalibrates to the changes, or as some people say, the lack of changes, here in Washington. At the same time, as we begin to talk about foreign policy in a second Obama administration, let's not forget that history doesn't stop or even slow down in the Middle East. Elections are coming up in Israel, in Jordan, in Egypt, Iran, and elsewhere. We're seeing in front of our eyes more violent change happening in Syria, the reverberations of which are being felt on every one of that country's borders. Elsewhere, from Beirut to Bahrain, domestic politics is at a low boil, ready to burst out in a way that can affect our interests in very fundamental ways. There are two problems at the far ends of the threat spectrum: the Iran nuclear challenge on one hand, and the spread of al-Qaeda and affiliated terrorism on the other, that will continue to dominate. And lest we forget, within a year of taking office, both Presidents Obama and Bush, his predecessor, were faced with previously unforeseen events that fundamentally challenged their Middle East policies. 9/11 for President Bush and the Arab Spring for President Obama. So, there's a lot on the agenda. Today we're going to take an early look at what will be and what should be the foreign policy of a second Obama administration in the Middle East. Now, we at the Washington Institute, for us, this is just the beginning of quite a number of events and undertakings. We'll be producing a series of transition papers on key issues, sometimes by our Sterling Institute research staff, sometimes by outside scholars and practitioners that we have commissioned to take a look at specific topics. And so over the next several weeks, we'll come together with some frequency, both here in person and in the cyber world, to focus on discrete individual topics. But today we begin this process with a more general discussion in which I and my two distinguished colleagues will examine the broader issues at stake in the Middle East for a second Obama administration. At this moment, if I just remind people, if you could please turn your cell phones off, not just to silent, but totally off. We are broadcasting live on C-SPAN, and we have other esteemed members of the journalist world here with us, filming and recording. Now, each of my colleagues has special experience dealing with second terms. My colleague Dennis Ross, who will lead off, first came to the White House at the beginning of a second term, the second Reagan administration. In fact, his first publication at the Washington Institute, just before going into the second Reagan administration, you didn't think he was that old, did you? The second Reagan administration was our first ever publication titled Middle East Policy Planning for a Second Reagan Administration. So Dennis has great experience in dealing with second administrations. He did it not just with Ronald Reagan, but he also did it on the other side of the aisle with President Bill Clinton. which he saw up close from the inside. Now, both of those administrations had fascinating initiatives in the Middle East. Dennis wasn't involved in the second Reagan administration's most noteworthy initiative, Iran's arms for hostages, but he was involved in the most noteworthy Middle East initiative of the second Clinton administration, which of course was a major push for Middle East peace in the final year of President Clinton's second term. On my left is Jim Jeffrey. Jim is a visiting fellow at the Washington Institute, just retired from diplomatic service after completing his tour as U.S. ambassador in Iraq. Prior to that posting, Jim served as U.S. ambassador to Turkey. So he was on the front lines of two of Iran's neighbors, and, lest we forget, also on the front lines of two of Syria's neighbors. So Jim had a fascinating perch in recent time to look at two of the most important issues on the administration's agenda. Jim also knows about second terms from his experience as Deputy National Security Advisor in the Bush administration. And that, of course, in that second term, we saw at least two major Middle East initiatives, the Iraq surge and the Annapolis process. So we have two second-term experts to open our discussion on what we will look for and what we should look for in the second term of President Obama's administration, and then I'll come back and offer some remarks of my own. First turn to Dennis Ross. Dennis.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you for reminding me of my age. For all of you, I was a child prodigy. That's one of the reasons I was assuming that role during the Reagan administration. It is true that I've had the experience of seeing and planning and working through the beginnings of second terms, although I think one of the most important things to keep in mind is precisely because it's a second term, you have an administration that already has an established approach to the world. You may well have different personnel who come in, but if in fact it's the president who has been shaping the policy and is a decision maker, you have a certain orientation. So I think the orientation is not something that is necessarily going to change, but you can see a set of challenges that have to be confronted. And if you look at the Obama administration and you look at the greater Middle East right now, the reality is that the three of us don't really have sufficient time to go through all the things they're going to confront. But let me just do a quick thumbnail sketch and then focus on a couple of the issues that I think are going to be most prominent in the early going. Iran, almost by definition, it's been an issue that has preoccupied the president from the very beginning of the administration. It's going to become even more important in 2013. I'm going to explain why I believe that 2013 will probably be a decisive year one way or the other. The Arab awakening. You said this was, I use the term awakening as opposed to spring, precisely because I think it has been an awakening. Spring implied that this was going to be a quick transformation. It was going to be an early flowering. We were all going to see this wonderful re-establishment of an entirely new kind of Middle East. And it was going to happen in a linear fashion, and we were all going to be thrilled by it. And the fact is, it isn't to say that at some point this Arab awakening may not, in fact, produce a really genuine change that could be for the better. But what's worth noting is it's going to take a long time before that actually materializes, if it does. That will obviously be on the agenda and will shape what the president does. Syria is one manifestation of the awakening, but it's a manifestation that has gone in a direction that is profoundly bad and increasingly looks like Syria could become a failed state unless something more is done. There is the ongoing challenges of al-Qaeda in North Africa. There are other challenges throughout the region, to be sure. There is the whole question of peace, and is an approach to two states going to be sustainable over time? So there are a series of broad challenges in the Middle East, and I haven't even mentioned one other one that could obviously be something that confronts the administration. That could be succession in Saudi Arabia, which in and of itself could raise a series of interesting kinds of questions. Now, if you think that these are the only challenges in foreign policy that the president's going to face, obviously that's not the case, but we're here to talk primarily about the broader Middle East. What happens in terms of the political change in China, its implications for our orientation, not only generally, how it affects the economy, but also in the Middle East, is something that has to be thought about. There is also the question of the future of the European Union, which will have an impact, again, not only on the economy, but could also have some impact in terms of what happens in the Middle East. We can reserve some of those questions for the Q&A. What I'd like to focus on are a few of the key issues that I think are most immediate, most prominent. Let me start with Iran. I do think 2013 is going to be a decisive year. Now, for many people who have long memories, I might say, well, gee, they've been hearing a lot of people talk about Iran for a long time, and every year is supposed to be the decisive year. Why do I say this should be the decisive year? For two reasons. One, I think actually the impact of sanctions is profound. For the first time, it is truly profound in the case of Iran. We had the Supreme Leader 2 weeks ago referring to the sanctions as being brutal. His word, the sanctions are brutal. Now, this is someone who has said on an ongoing basis, look, we've lived with sanctions since the beginning of the Islamic Republic. The sanctions make us stronger. The sanctions make us self-sufficient. He has a long litany of describing how the sanctions, in effect, are something that ultimately Iran will turn to its benefit. Now he's saying that sanctions are brutal, and the truth is they are brutal. You look at what's happening in the Iranian energy area, it's not only the fact that they're able to sell, less than 50% of what they were selling before, it's that their production, their output, is down from over 4 million barrels a day to 2.6 million barrels a day. And part of the reason for that is precisely because of the sanctions, the inability to continue to invest in their energy infrastructure, the inability to continue to pump and store oil. As they shut down oil fields, it may not be so easy for them to recoup. You look at what's happening to the currency, the devaluation. There are some estimates that the currency is being devalued by about half every 2 months. Think about what that means. It means that what you're buying, when you go and you buy something, it costs you twice as much. It means what you have in the bank is worth half as much. If this is continuing to happen, it's bound to have an effect on the society as a whole. And again, look at what the Supreme Leader has been saying over the last couple of weeks. On more than one occasion, he has explicitly called for officials to stop fighting each other. Now, that's not the first time that's happened, but it is interesting when you look at what some of the criticisms are. When the head of the Revolutionary Guard is criticizing the head of the central bank for the currency problem, that says something interesting. Why is the Revolutionary Guard commenting on the currency? It's not just that the Speaker of their parliament is attacking the Iranian president, so is the head of the military attacking the Iranian president for the mismanagement. The focus on their economic problems has become more acute, and in a sense, what that suggests to me is, again, they may well be increasing their interest in looking for a way out. You look at some of their commentary today that's emerging. When you have the Ministry of Intelligence website offering a kind of analysis where it even suggests that diplomacy could make sense and is obviously better than seeing the use of force. These are not the kind of commentaries that you've necessarily seen in the past. It doesn't mean that diplomacy is necessarily guaranteed to produce an outcome that we want, but it means, in my mind, that the chances for diplomacy working and producing something may be greater now than before. But that's not necessarily the only reason, or necessarily even the most important reason, why I say that this year could be a decisive year. The reason is, even though they're under great economic strain and penalty, their nuclear program continues. And the problem from our standpoint is that the President has made very clear that our objective is prevention, not containment. Preventing them from having a nuclear weapon, not living with it after the fact. Now, the problem is, by the end of 2013, if the pace of the current development of the nuclear program continues, we may no longer be in a position to know that we could actually prevent them from presenting the world with a fait accompli. So that means, to me, if your objective is prevention, and by the end of 2013 you may not know whether, in fact, you can prevent them from actually presenting the world with a nuclear fait accompli, then that increases a sense of urgency about getting something done. The combination of what the impact of sanctions have been, the reality that prevention, if it's going to have meaning, we may have to act on it before the end of 2013, leads me to conclude that we will see some kind of significant diplomatic initiative by the President, by the Obama administration, on the nuclear issue with the Iranians, because no president is going to end up using force without having demonstrated unmistakably to the world and to the American public that we exhausted every possibility before we ended up resorting to the use of force. What I'm suggesting to you is the combination of the pressure on the one hand, the pace of their program on the other, and the likelihood that they will at least be given a way out means we will see this come to a head. Either we'll find a diplomatic way out during the course of this year, or the prospect of the use of force, I think, goes up dramatically. So for me, 2013 is likely to be decisive on Iran. The second issue I want to raise is Syria. What we are seeing happen with Syria is obviously a trend that increasingly looks like Syria could well become a failed state. Now, the prospect of Syria becoming a failed state, given who its neighbors are, I mean, Iraq, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and Israel, the prospect of it becoming a failed state and the conflict on the inside radiating outward, and we're seeing more and more examples of that, all of that creates an increasing pressure to try to do more to affect the situation there. It is not an accident in my mind that the Secretary of State has focused on trying to do more now to create an alternative to the Syrian National Council and produce a more coherent Syrian opposition. My own feeling is that that's one step that will be taken. I think there will be more steps that will need to be taken. And I think in this regard, one of the things to keep focused on is not just this emerging idea that has come out of Turkey about a new way to produce a no-fly zone, meaning use patriots as a more interesting, innovative, creative way of possibly creating no-fly zones. That may or may not be something that gets explored. I do believe that the prospect of us providing lethal assistance to the Syrian opposition will also go up. And I say that because the balance of forces in the Syrian opposition is such that as time goes by and the radical Islamists are the ones who always seem to have the money and always seem to have the weapons, they will become much more dominant in terms of that opposition. That does not serve American interests, and it certainly doesn't serve the interests of stability in the region. So here again, I think the prospect of the administration seeing the need to do more is going to go up. I think the focus on the opposition is one manifestation of that, but I think that won't be the only one. The third area that I would like to focus on briefly is the whole issue of the Arab awakening, but principally with an eye towards Egypt. You know, what we see in Egypt is what I call an interesting duality of realities. On the one hand, we find the Muslim Brotherhood. President Morsi is no longer a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, but clearly he surrounds himself with people who are. And the reality is today the Muslim Brotherhood controls the institutions of the state with the exception of the judiciary. One can assume that they will make more and more an effort to gain control over that as well. But the Muslim Brotherhood continues to have a very clear ideology. Anybody who thinks that that ideology is somehow going to disappear, I think, is kidding themselves. And when I talk about a dual reality that seems to exist, you see on the one hand a reality where President Morsi sends a letter to Shimon Peres, and after Shimon Peres' office releases the letter, and there's a backlash from the Muslim Brotherhood, President Morsi comes out and denies that he sent the letter. It's never a really good sign when you deny a fact, because in a sense, either your politics or your ideology don't permit you to acknowledge a fact. When 16 Egyptian soldiers were killed in the Sinai, the Muslim Brotherhood's first response to it was to accuse the Mossad of doing it. Again, obviously not true. Obviously having to create a reality that is an alternative reality. Not a good sign. It's true President Morsi didn't say that, but the Muslim Brotherhood did say that. A couple of weeks ago, the Supreme Guide of the Muslim Brotherhood body came out and said all Jews are corrupt, called for jihad, and said the only thing the Israelis understand is violence. When there was a backlash from the outside, the Muslim Brotherhood came out and said, well, they didn't say it. When you have to deny reality, it says something about the durability of your belief system. It says something about the inability to adjust it to the real world, and that's not a good sign. But there's another reality that also seems to exist at the same time, and that is a recognition that somehow, if the Muslim Brotherhood and if President Morsi are going to have credibility and build their legitimacy within Egypt, they have to deliver. And that means addressing the economy. And that requires a certain set of imperatives. Now, here it's interesting that when the Muslim Brotherhood was not in power, when the SCAF was still in power, the Muslim Brotherhood was against the IMF standby loan because of the one of the reasons is at least the conditionality that was going to be imposed. Now, President Morsi is in favor of it, and not only is prepared to accept the conditionality, but wants the loan not to be $3.2 billion, but $4.8 billion. Again, recognizing that there's an economic need and there's a need to respond to it. You had maybe the largest delegation of American business people go about 6 weeks ago to Egypt, led by the American Chamber of Commerce. They met President Morsi, they met all the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, and everyone they spoke to said, we want to do business with you. We want to partner with you. We want to create an environment and a climate that makes it possible for you to invest in us. We know we need this. Their Renaissance plan itself is governed by a certain economic logic and rationality. So here are two different interesting realities. The economic imperatives seem to be understood by the Egyptian leadership. The recognition that somehow they actually have a public that they have to respond to. This is not simply the Egypt in Mubarak where you could discount the public, seems to affect their thinking. And that has implications for what the administration will do. It means that if we stand by certain principles, which in my mind also reflect practicalities, that we have an ability to affect their behavior. What does it mean in terms of principles? It means, well, first and foremost, respect minority rights. That's a principle for us, but it's also a practicality for them. If you see large numbers of the Coptic Christians leaving Egypt, that's not exactly going to be a source of encouragement for people on the outside to invest. If they exclude half their population, and 56% of Egyptian women are illiterate, this is not a prescription for a successful society. It's our principle, but it's also their practicality. You look at the draft constitution and you see some language in there about equality that is quite reassuring. You see other language in there about principles of Sharia, which depending upon how they're interpreted, may not be as encouraging. If they maintain political pluralism, which is something that, again, ultimately if they want to succeed, they're going to need to, something that fits their practicality but fits our principles, it ought to guide us. And lastly, they have to fulfill their international obligations. First and foremost, living up to the peace treaty with Israel. Now here again, it may be our principle, but it's also their practicality. Who is going to invest in Egypt if they look like they're trying to invite a confrontation or a conflict with Israel? The answer is nobody. And the extent to which they are very much governed by the need to address their economic needs and imperatives suggests to me that there is an approach that we can have and that the administration will have. And I'll just note that, in the first 24 hours after our embassy was under assault and nothing was done, when the president called President Morsi and said, you don't protect our people, you get nothing from us, lo and behold, all of the inhibitions that were there for the first 24 hours, not wanting to look like the Mubarak regime, not wanting to look like they weren't standing up with other Islamists on the street, given this affront to Islam that was embodied in the video, suddenly all that disappeared, and they provided protection. It means that if we are governed by principles and practicalities, so much for turning off cell phones. One thing I know for sure is not for me. Then I think that we have a chance, I think, to try to shape what can happen in Egypt with full humility. Look, this is a story that's being written by them. It's not going to be written by us. But the extent to which, in fact, they need help from the outside, we should be prepared to provide it. We don't want a failed state in Egypt, but there should be ground rules for it, and I think that will also be something that is very prominent for the administration, and I think the administration will act on it. All right, I have 2 more minutes? Okay, 2 more minutes. The peace issue. One of the realities of the Arab awakening is that it's had a chilling effect on both sides. Abu Mazen looks at the growth of political Islam, the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, the impact that may have not only with regard to Hamas, but in the whole area around him. And if he thinks about making compromise, what he sees is the high likelihood that this is going to produce a backlash. He gives an interview with Channel 2 in Israel, where he speaks that he's personally not going back to Sfat, and you see him being burned in effigy and demonstrations against him in Gaza, and he can assume what the consequences are if, in fact, he takes these kinds of steps. So it's had a chilling effect on him. Also, given what you see with the Arab awakening, it's made him, perhaps not for surprising reasons, act more as a populist. The flip side is within Israel. Same thing. You're going to do a deal with Abu Mazen. Is it going to be durable? What are you going to face right after it? This is a time where, rather than thinking about taking big leaps forward, there's a tendency to sort of think about what are the risks and not what are the opportunities. I would say it's understandable that both sides have that view, but I would also say something else. The status quo won't remain static. The demographic clock will keep ticking. The intellectual currents among a lot of younger Palestinians is to say, let's just do one person, one vote. I think one of the big challenges for the administration is going to be, how do you preserve the possibility of a two-state outcome, which remains in America's interest and remains, frankly, in Israeli interest and Palestinian interests. Palestinians will never achieve their aspirations if they go in terms of a one-state outcome, because that's not going to happen. But Israel also has an interest in a two-state outcome, because ultimately they don't have an interest in having the demographic clock dictate what Israel's future is going to be. So I think the key challenge for the administration is, how do you preserve a two-state approach? And I think the real issue at this point is, how do you contend with the greatest single problem, which in my mind is disbelief on each side. The Israeli public believes today that Palestinians are not interested in a two-state outcome. And if they talk about two states, it's only part of a phased approach, or it's a Palestinian state and a binational state. And Palestinians look at the Israelis and they say, they're not interested in two states. They're never going to surrender control over us. And if they're interested in two states, why do they build and what should be part of our state? So neither one has a belief that the other is really committed to two states. And I think the challenge at this point is, how do you change that dynamic? Since I said I only have 2 more minutes, I do have a 14-point proposal, which actually I do have a 14-point proposal, and I could do it in about 3 minutes, but you want me to wait until the... All right. I always take my guidance. If you hadn't noticed that, I know there's a lot of rumors about me that I never took guidance. That's just not true. Well, I took it at times. Anyway, I think the point is that if you look at Iran, Syria, the Arab awakening, and the peace issue, that is a huge agenda for the administration in the Middle East. And I haven't made a reference to the transition. If we're talking about the greater Middle East, I haven't made a reference to the transition in Afghanistan, which by definition, this is a critical year for the administration on that. And obviously, it's a signature issue for the president. So that will obviously have to be part of what is done. And then there's the one last sort of wild card, which is there are always wild cards in the Middle East. Every administration always faces a surprise. So one of the things you're trying to do as you think about at the beginning of any term, whether it's a first term or it's a transition to the second term, you're trying to think about what can you do to shape the landscape so that you're in a much better position to deal with surprises when they come. I'll stop there.
Good. Thank you. Jim.
Thank you, Rob. It's no fun following Dennis, but a couple of initial points. First of all, I agree very much with him about this administration's follow-on second term will probably be similar to the first, perhaps not quite as prudent, but I think, and that is probably a good thing. But I will say from my own experience, the second Bush 43 administration was wildly different, probably fortunately, than the first administration. So anything is possible out there. And so let's begin. I'll talk a little bit about some of the same issues that Dennis raised from a different perspective, and then go forward a bit on some of the other issues that we're going to be looking at. First of all, job one in our diplomacy for the Middle East has to be continuing to rebuild our economic and financial strength here at home. This is vitally important. We see this not only in the ability to maintain our military strength, upon which so much rests, but also we see this as important for something like the Iran sanctions. It's thanks to the financial strength of our system that we can put banks around the world under pressure. dealing with Iran. It's because of the relations that we have, diplomatic and energy, with countries from Iraq to Saudi Arabia, that we can count on the additional production to balance the loss of Iranian oil. And it's because of our own growth in hydrocarbons production here at home that we're able to absorb some of this and move forward. So this is very, very important, and I think that we should focus on that, and I know that the Obama administration will. But nonetheless, there is a famous quote that may be misattributed to Leon Trotsky, which says that you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Well, we may not be interested as we focus on the economy on the Middle East, but believe me, the Middle East, including its wars, are interested in us. As Dennis said, not only Afghanistan, but our transition out of Iraq has led to a perception in some circles out in the field that the United States is withdrawing from the region. This isn't true, because at the same time, we're building up, just on the military side, air defense and other support for Israel, missile defense systems in Turkey, very strong development of coalition military defense capabilities in the Gulf, and continued operations against al-Qaeda. But nonetheless, that is one of the first things that the Obama administration is going to have to do, is to deal with this perception that on the military side, we are pulling out. We're not, but the perception is out there. As Dennis said, Iran is critical. He went through the main reasons why Iran is so focused on our attention, or why we have so much attention on it. I would just like to add that in looking at the breadth as well as the depth of the problem with Iran, its impact on non-proliferation, regional stability, oil markets, the world economy, which is dependent upon the price of oil, our relations with Israel, the role of the Security Council and our role in the Security Council and the UN system, almost everything that's important is in stake at this. This is the most critical and most dangerous situation that the administration will be facing in the next year. Looking at it, though, and while this year is critical, as Dennis said, we have to realize that this isn't all about some misunderstanding or some fixable problem with Iran not getting it about its civil nuclear program or even its nuclear weapons program colliding with the international community. These are all manifestations of a long-term confrontation that we and the rest of the West and most of the region has had with Iran at least since the 1970s. And this confrontation will go on, regardless of whether we do get a nuclear deal or we have a strike to prevent Iran from moving to that nuclear weapons capability. We're going to have to deal with this problem over the long term, just as we have over the last 30 years, because it flows from Iran's view of its role in the region and the inconsistency of that view with the view of the other countries in the region, our values and our role both in the region and as a leading power throughout the world. A couple of issues related to this that we need to look at. First of all, the Obama administration has done, I think, a very good job, first of all, reaching out a hand to Iran. That didn't work. Then a very tough set of policies ranging from the sanctions to the military deployments in the region that have basically beefed up our capability to withstand an Iranian action and to threaten Iran's nuclear capabilities if it comes to that. In addition, the president, in taking the prevention position and making it clear that this includes military force, and while he avoided red lines, going a little bit closer to that in the debates by talking about breakout capacity, he has basically laid down a very, very important marker. This is a very serious thing, because if Iran were ever to move to that point and we were not to react, we would lose an awful lot of not just face in the region, but we would lose an awful lot of support, I would predict. So we have to be ready to carry that out. I sympathize with the president on the issue of red lines, although that can be debated either way. It's a lot of arguments one way or the other, but certainly no administration likes to be tied down. But there's one potential red line, or at least fact out there, that we have to deal with in any prevention scenario where we don't say exactly when we would strike. And that is, and Dennis alluded to this, if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, what do we do then? One argument would be if we get evidence that they have a nuclear device or a nuclear capability, or they have enough uranium to very quickly, enriched uranium, very quickly develop one of these things, and it can be done very quickly in that case, a strong argument can be made that we make it clear that we will strike under those circumstances. That's more dangerous, but believe me, an Iran with a nuclear capability that everybody recognizes is going to be very, very, very hard to contain. In looking at the military side, one of the things that we do want to avoid, of course, is a military clash with Iran from the conventional side, be it in the aftermath of a strike, be it through an accident or some other incident such as we had from 1986 to 1988 with Iran. It is very, very important that, if possible, we avoid this, and the Iranians avoid this, because of the risk of the action spreading. The uncontrolled nature of this, even more than most military engagements, and the impact, of course, on oil markets, the Straits of Hormuz, and all these other things that everybody in here knows. But we have to be prepared to face this eventuality. This means that we have to be in a position militarily to deter under almost any conditions an Iranian act of adventurism. And if this deterrence fails, we have to be able to win. We have to be able to win decisively. This is absolutely critical. It's what we did in 1988, and it had a very sanguine effect on Iranian reactions to us for a decade to come. So that is something that will require continued American attention and continued American deployments. Beginning with the January 2012 Defense Policy Guidance paper, which people refer to as the pivot, the emphasis seems to be on Asia, including a military emphasis. I would urge that we ensure that maintaining the air, naval, and air and missile defense systems in the Gulf region to deter, or if necessary, defeat Iran should remain our #1 military priority, at least through this very dangerous period coming up in the year plus ahead. Finally, on Iran, given the complexities of this thing, and Dennis and I have both worked in the White House, and we know how extraordinarily difficult it is to coordinate various agencies and activities. With Iran, we have energy policy, we have financial policy, we have overall economic policy, we have intelligence policy, including covert operations, we have obviously the military wing of our operations, and we have diplomacy, including the nuclear account. It is very, very important that this be closely coordinated on a daily level, at least the sub-cabinet level. And we hope that the administration will take a look at how that can best be done. It cannot be business as usual with Iran in the year ahead. There are models. David Makovsky from the Institute in the New Yorker wrote about the way the U.S. government organized itself at that level to deal with the Al-Kabar reactor in Syria on a daily, high-level basis. The Bush administration organized its Iraq policy with General Lute in another way. There are several models out there, but again, it's important that Iran not be seen as one of 10 or 15 problems we have to deal with on a daily basis. Iran is problem #1 and is going to stay problem #1 for a while. On the other hand, the beauty of the Middle East is there are plenty of other problems that if they don't compete with Iran, they do compete with each other. And let me touch on a couple. First, Syria. Again, I concur with everything Dennis said, but a couple of other points that we're going to have to all focus on. First of all, for the longest time, many people thought that the fall of Assad was inevitable, so therefore we wouldn't have to do that much to provoke it. I'm not so sure. Not because I don't think that this insurgency is effective. I've been, unfortunately, on the receiving end of a number of insurgencies in my careers, and this is a very, very powerful one. It's a very effective one. The problem is that Iran has committed powerful friends that appear to be, rather Syria has committed powerful friends that appear to be ready to go to the mat to ensure that the Assad regime will stay in power and maintain control over at least part of Syria, and that, of course, is Russia and Iran. The result could be an Assad that stays in power, an Iranian victory, which is not going to be good for our simultaneous efforts to try to move Iran to the negotiating table or to see sense on nuclear weapons, and in wide portions of Syria, a no man's land rather like the Fatah or Somalia, where militants, perhaps, probably associated with al-Qaeda, will find a new home. We already see some of this. This is another reason why the administration needs to engage, including engaging through military means if necessary, directly or indirectly through providing weapons, things like no-fly zones. We need to do more. We need to do more urgently, or this thing is going to slip out of control. At best, and it isn't very good, in Syria itself, at worst, we're going to see an emerging Shia-Sunni fissure across the Middle East that will be followed by violence and fighting in Iraq and elsewhere. Let me touch on Iraq. It hasn't received too much commentary either in the debates, in the campaign, or even in some of the discussions about post-election foreign policy priorities. But it needs to be a priority for several reasons. First of all, Iraq is a success. It's a success largely because of the efforts of the United States and our allies and of the Iraqi people. And it's an important success because it's right in the middle of the Middle East. It ties into every other problem from Iran to Shia-Sunni relations, to the Kurds, to Turkey, and above all, to energy. It is a democratic state with a lot of flaws, but it's still a functioning democracy, and that's a good thing, and something that we need to do our best to try to continue to encourage. The administration is putting a lot of quiet effort into this. This needs to continue. There are several serious risks. The biggest is, of course, that Syria will pull Iraq asunder as the various groups go in various directions. The Kurds in one direction, the Sunnis in another, and the Shia supporting Iran and the Assad government. So far that has not happened, but the longer the situation in Syria is allowed to continue, the more likely that that very bad scenario will occur. And remember, one of the main reasons we kept our troops in Iraq and we lost 4,500 troops was to maintain the unity of Iraq. That unity depends on plurality and democracy. That's what we have now with all of its faults. It needs to be supported. The other major threat to it is the debate, struggle, disputes between the Kurds in the north and the central government under Prime Minister Maliki. That's a complicated issue, but one of the factors that are playing a huge role is oil. Oil is either the glue that will hold Iraq together, with Kurdistan contributing to some degree to the massive increase in Iraqi exports that we will see by the end of this decade. 45% of all new crude oil that will come on international markets is predicted to come out of Iraq, mainly from the south, but some from the north, if all goes well. But that's a big if, and that's something we have to play a huge role in. We are. The administration has been particularly engaged since the summer on working a deal that currently is in place to get the Kurdish oil in the north, 200,000 barrels a day, exported to Ceyhan, Turkey, out of pipelines that are controlled by the central government. But it's a very difficult balance. It's being pulled in different directions. The Turks play a role. The Iranians are potential players in this as well. They're not too happy at the increase in Iraqi oil exports. So this is an area where the administration needs to continue its focus. Finally, on al-Qaeda. Dennis touched on that. I've touched on that a little bit with Syria. But this remains a very, very dangerous threat, not only to us, but to stability in the region. And there is a new factor that we saw in Iraq and didn't think we would see elsewhere, and that is al-Qaeda portraying itself as the champion of the Sunni Muslims against the Shia Muslims. Again, back in 2005, 2006, when Zarqawi was pushing this, he was under criticism from the headquarters, if you will, in the Fatah about doing that the target should be the Americans rather than Shia Muslims. In fact, by the time I was in Iraq, al-Qaeda was basically leaving us alone, and that was partially because we were very heavily armored and armed, but the other reason was their target of preference was the Shia. We're seeing this again in Syria. This is a very, very bad development. It can tear the region apart. We went to war twice in the Balkans, in Bosnia and in Kosovo, to prevent just such a split along religious lines in the Balkans. The Middle East is far more important and far more dangerous than the Balkans. So we need to watch this. Finally, on al-Qaeda, For various legal reasons, as well as political, domestic reasons, and diplomatic reasons, we see this as a war. But we have not done a good job recently explaining to the American people the implications of that. If it's a war, why then do we put these people on trial? There are answers to that as illegal enemy combatants. But this is a complex issue that is now crystallized in the criticism of the drones. What we don't want to do is to have a lack of clarity about our goals and our tools lead to a situation, as we saw before 9/11, that we're afraid to go after these people because we don't think that we have enough legitimacy. We don't think we have enough support from the American people. Right now, throughout the broader Middle East, in all of the areas where there is not effective government control, from the Fatah to Mali to Somalia, although the situation is doing better, to Yemen, previously in Fallujah and other places, Al-Qaeda or Al-Qaeda-linked groups pop up. They're a threat to the stability of the region, they are a threat to us, and they need to be kept under the highest pressure. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Let's imagine for a minute that there's a courageous National Security Council staff member who's writing a memo to the president outlining Middle East policy for a second term. Or maybe he's not such a courageous staffer and he already has a job lined up outside government, perhaps at a think tank like this. He might offer the following remarks to the president. First, 4 broad lessons I urge you to take from your first-term experience. 1, as much as we would like to wish it away, it's a mistake to think one can pivot away from the Middle East and toward Asia as though we have just a fixed amount of bandwidth and the luxury of reapportioning it based on our preference. For the foreseeable future, we can't avoid dealing with threats and challenges emanating from this region. 2, Middle East politics, Mr. President, revolves around 2 main threats. 1, the ambitions of a hegemonic Iran, and 2, the spread of radical Sunni extremism. This is what defines Middle East politics in the early years of the 21st century. Other issues, such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, are important, especially important to Israelis and Palestinians, but have little impact on the larger scheme of things. 3, in this part of the world, perhaps elsewhere, there are few happily ever afters. What starts with remarkable hope and inspiration rarely ends that way. Look at the bloodless revolution in Tunis, the spirit of Tahrir Square, the amazing courage of the peaceful protesters in Dera, and look where they're all today. Of course, anyone who followed the Oslo process for the last 19 years learned this lesson a long time ago. But you, Mr. President, like everyone else in a new administration, learns it for the first time. And last, as an overall lesson, as much as words matter, whether it's the Cairo speech you delivered in 2009 or your repeated and important declarations on prevention of Iran's nuclear capabilities, actions matter most. Don't mistake the former for the latter. And today, I just have to step out of my role for a moment because as a historian, today is the anniversary of my favorite ever presidential statement on the Middle East. 70 years ago today, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt issued the following statement to the peoples of the Middle East. Just imagine a president saying this. Praise be unto you in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. O ye Muslims, may the blessing of God be upon you. This is a great day for you, because behold, we, the American holy warriors, have arrived. We have come here to fight the great jihad of freedom. We have come to set you free. Today is the 70th anniversary of the landing on North Africa. And just imagine an American president praising the great jihad of American freedom once again. But we don't remember that because words matter so much less than actions. All right. If those are 3 broad lessons, what are the 3 most urgent issues on your agenda? Here I won't repeat the words of my colleagues because Iran nuclear negotiations and dealing with Iran more generally, number 1. bringing down Assad as quickly as possible, number 2. But the third I would add is the following: preventing the collapse of one or more additional pro-Western regimes, especially pro-Western monarchies. 3 are at the top of the list: Bahrain, Jordan, and Morocco. Now, Morocco, Mr. President, has figured out a recipe for its survival, and Bahrain has big brother Saudi Arabia looking out for it. Jordan, however, is the most vulnerable, and the one whose loss would undermine U.S. interests in multiple and immediate ways. Now, for the life of me, I've not heard a good explanation as to why the Saudis are providing virtually no assistance today to Jordan. And as a corollary, I can't understand why the Saudis are providing virtually no assistance today to Egypt. Just think of what is going on in Jordan and Egypt today. These two countries, each of whom borders the world's most resource-rich, energy-rich part of the world, today are undergoing rather draconian restrictions on the uses of energy. The lights are out in Cairo every night at 10 o'clock, and Jordan has gas rationing, and they live virtually right next door to Saudi Arabia. All right, if those are 3 most urgent issues, who are the 3 leaders who deserve your special attention, Mr. President? Well, first, let's start with the Prime Minister of Israel. If he gets another term as Prime Minister, he will be with you throughout your presidency, locked at the hip, or perhaps another part of the anatomy. There's no percentage in having another 4 years like the first 2 that you had with him. Your interests, state to state, are consonant and complementary. You don't have to love each other, but you have a big agenda with each other, a big agenda that requires you to work together. It is very important for Mr. Netanyahu to work together with you. You, of course, are the great power. Israel is the small power. But you have a role to play in building a new relationship with him as well. Secondly, and here I'll echo in a certain fashion what Jim Jeffrey just said. The second leader I would put on this list is the Prime Minister of Iraq, Prime Minister Maliki. Iraq is the third rail of U.S. Middle East diplomacy. No one wants to talk about it in public because it conjures up such bad memories from the last decade. But Iraq is important. Geography is destiny, and Iraq's geography between Iran and Syria is critical to the future of the Middle East and to our interests in this part of the world. We have an important role to play. He is the Prime Minister of a democratically elected government. We need to find a way to work with him better. Third, building on something Dennis said in passing, the third leader I would focus on isn't a particular person, it's the next generation of Saudi leaders. As my colleague Simon Henderson noted earlier this week, there's already been the beginning of the jump to the next generation with the appointment of a new interior minister from the next generation of Saudi princes. The remaining sons of the founder, Ibn Saud, may see their demise, political as well as actuarial, in quick succession during your next term as president. Now is the time, before that happens, to build deeper understandings on strategy and reform with the leaders that will come to take their place. So, what then are 3 calamities we can prevent and we have to think about preventing? Well, I referred a moment ago to the demise of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. I won't go on about that. But secondly would be the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. It is, of course, a bit of a luxury to think about resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict over the next 4 years. It would be important and a vital interest of the United States to prevent moving backwards in the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. And the most dangerous backward move would be the collapse of the Palestinian Authority. There are important measures that the United States can do to help Israelis and Palestinians build on the less well-known but important achievements that are underway, economic relationships, security relationships, and to help ensure that the Palestinian Authority stays intact, at least to continue to provide the potential for renewed diplomacy in the future. The third calamity that we can prevent the emergence of a jihadist enclave in Sinai. We should not overlook the possibility that Sinai, that buffer zone that made peace possible a generation ago, becomes the source of renewed conflict in the years ahead. We have an important role to play, working especially with the government of Egypt and with Egypt and Israel together, both militarily and in terms of civilian investment, to make sure that Sinai does not become the Fatah, does not to become Somalia, does not to become the source that exports instability throughout the area. What are three big initiatives that we can undertake? Well, here I will repeat one that Dennis referred to, which is rethinking our relationship with Egypt under Islamist rule. Our current approach toward Egypt, if you look at the mechanics and the tools we use, is essentially a holdover from the Mubarak era with a few band-aids on it. We haven't really thought through a strategy, a policy, a tools, and a method of implementation of a new relationship with Islamist-governed Egypt. This applies to aid, our military relationship, our outreach to civil society, the whole range of items. Secondly, and more specifically, an initiative that is related to Egypt-Israel relations. There won't be a U.S.-Egypt free trade agreement, given all the uncertainty in Egypt within the foreseeable future. But if it is serious, Egypt can reap many of the benefits of free trade through a massive expansion of the QIZ system with Israel. Israel would do this deal in a heartbeat and would even lower the amount of Israeli content required to be as part of the deal. But that would require the Islamist president of Egypt to recognize the benefits of a much significantly broadened QIZ relationship and to, in fact, utter the word publicly, Israel, something which he hasn't yet done in his official capacity. A third initiative, repairing Turkish-Israel ties. It's overdue, it's in our interest, and the interest of both these countries. I know, Mr. President, you tried once to do this, and we did not succeed. But times have changed. Syria has happened. Erdogan is weaker today than before, and should Bibi Netanyahu get elected, he will be stronger after his election than he was the last time we tried to do this. After the politics is clarified, it's time to try this again. Well, one last set of items. What are the game changers? What are the unknowns, as Dennis referred to, that every administration has to deal with at some point in this part of the world? I'm sure I will succumb to a lack of adequate creativity, but here at least are a handful of game changers that may occur on your watch for which we need to be prepared. First, the next wave of mass and potentially violent protest. Already I mentioned the possibilities in Jordan and Bahrain. Let's not rule out in Saudi Arabia. After the events of 2011, who can say with 100% certainty that the recent signs of some unrest, of some rioting, of some protest may not catch fire even in Saudi Arabia? Second, terrorism. Affirming what Jim said a moment ago. This, of course, happened to President Bush from an unforeseen way in 9/11. It almost happened again to President Obama with the attacks in Benghazi. We should not rule out the entire range of potential terrorist attacks and what that would do to America's relations and to America's set of priorities in the Middle East. Taking down an airplane, blowing up a series of embassies, attacking civilians, foreign governments, as was tried in Washington with the attack on the Saudi ambassador, foreign governments attempt using terrorism even on our soil. There's a whole range of possibilities here. Let's not foreclose dealing with them. Third, a Sinai clash on steroids. We saw in August 2011 how the attempt by terrorists, the effort by terrorists to kill Israelis triggered an Israeli reaction that ended up with the Egypt-Israel peace treaty being this far away from total collapse. I measure this as being the thickness on the door of the Israeli embassy in Cairo, outside of which the protesters were banging down the door to attack the Israeli diplomats on the other side of the door. And that was when the military controlled Egypt. Today, there's a different situation. Another clash triggered by terrorists seeking to promote Egypt-Israel conflict, eminently possible. We have to prepare now to prevent a spiral of escalation. Fourth, we have warned about this, but the potential for WMD use in Syria and a deployment, as we have promised, of massive numbers of American soldiers, perhaps in concert with the troops from other nations, into the conflict in Syria. This would be a dramatic change on the ground and would transform not just the Syria conflict, but would transform your hopes for keeping American boots off the ground of the Middle East throughout your second term. Fifth, a moment perhaps of opportunity. The Green Movement Redux. Let us not rule out the possibility that as elections approach in Iran or some other triggering event, there is a resurgence of popular calls for change on the streets of Tehran. Let's be prepared this time, differently than we were prepared last time, for taking advantage of this and hopefully moving Iran into a different direction. And finally, something that Dennis referred to, the potential for surprise Iranian breakout. This needs to be prevented at all costs, Mr. President. So far, as you've noticed, I have avoided in this memo using the word legacy, not once. But remember this, if you try to resolve all the other issues on this list, or if you try to fix the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, you may fail and people may never remember it. After all, you will be the sixth president in a row to try and fail to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But if on your watch, Iran breaks out and achieves a nuclear weapon capability, this is what will be on your epitaph. You were the first president to be on his watch when Iran got the bomb. So this president, these are my suggestions. I'm going to take a vacation. Thank you all very much. We'll open the floor for your questions. If you can please identify to whom you are making the question, and I'll ask my colleagues to come up here to respond for the benefit of the cameras, to respond from the microphone. All the way in the far back, sir. There's microphones that are around. Please.
Jamie Weinstein from the Daily Caller. My question is mainly for Dennis Ross, but please, if anyone else has any thing to say, please jump in. My question is this. If the grand bargain that supposedly the administration is working on with Iran fails, having been in the administration, are you confident that the president would use force, a military strike, against Iran to set back its program? And the second part of this question related to Iran is that there's some reports that Valerie Jarrett is leading negotiations with the Iranian regime on the grand bargain. Do you know if that's true? And is she qualified to lead such negotiations?
I have no idea whether that's true. I would be very surprised were it to be the case. The administration has plenty of highly skilled people who know the issue and are immersed in it. So if there's going to be a negotiation at some point, I'm quite confident that it will include those people. A, I think there will be a negotiation, as I said. B, I think there will be some kind of diplomatic initiative that will be designed to test the proposition that the Iranians want only what they say they want, meaning the Iranians say they want civil nuclear power. I can envision a kind of proposal that would allow them to have civil nuclear power, but with the restrictions that would prevent them from being able to convert that into a nuclear weapons capability, number one. Number two, I am quite convinced that the president very seriously would like to achieve this through diplomatic means, but I'm also persuaded that there was a debate within the administration. The president thought about it very carefully. The debate was between prevention and containment. He made a very conscious decision for prevention. And I think once he made that decision, he also understood that has implications. If diplomacy fails, it leads you down the path towards the use of force. Do I think that he would act on it? I think absolutely he would act on it. But I think like anyone, he would like to achieve this through diplomatic means. Ultimately, I think our best chance of achieving it through diplomatic means is continuing to have the pressure felt, which it is being felt, making it clear that when it comes to diplomacy, we want it to succeed, but the Iranians have much more to lose from its failure than anyone else.
Mr. Erekat on my left.
Thank you. My question is to Ambassador Ross. My name is Saeed Erekat from Al-Quds Daily newspaper. Sir, Dr. Satloff just suggested to the newly re-elected president that concluding peace between the Israelis and Palestinians with a two-state solution is no longer a priority, while maintaining the PA is. What, in your opinion, what could happen to really re-inject some life into this process and give it some priority? Thank you.
Well, as I said, I had a 14-point proposal, and now that you've asked me for it, I will... Look, I think the key is how do you preserve the possibility of a two-state outcome when you have such disbelief on the part of both publics? And specifically what I was trying to get at is it's disbelief about the commitment of the other side to two states. And the idea that somehow you're going to be able to make peace in a context of complete disbelief, I think, is an illusion. So somehow you have to try to restore belief, or at least you have to try to find some way to give each side a reason to take a second look. And that's why I would like, and what I suggest when I outline these 14 points, I don't want them to be doing it unilaterally, because I think what we've seen from unilateralism is the only thing it breeds is the worst kind of unilateralism. What you need to restore is a kind of faith in peacemaking, and that's not, it hasn't been a loss of confidence. That's too trivial. Confidence you rebuild, you restore. When you lose faith, it's fundamental, and that has to be, somehow that really does, you have to work very hard to rebuild that. So I would like these 14 points are more designed to be an agenda for conversations, because the conversations they have today are mostly conversations where they talk past each other. So on the Israeli side, the kind of agenda items that I would like to see them be prepared to discuss with the Palestinians would be, first, to be prepared to offer compensation to any settler who would be prepared to leave. The logic, either leave or go back to the blocks. The logic is, again, if the other side is convinced that all you are about is, preserving your control or continuing to build in what is their state, this is a way of saying, no, that's not the case. Second, start building housing within Israel that would accommodate those who would leave. Again, sends the same kind of message, but it also sends a message to your own settlers. Those who are forced out of Gaza feel that they weren't taken care of. Third, build only in the blocks. Now, the Israeli definition of the blocks is 8% to the west of the barrier. The Palestinian definition of the blocks would be significantly smaller, but that's what they should negotiate about. When you build only in the blocks, you send a message. We mean what we say about two states. We're building in the blocks. We're building in that part of the West Bank that we consider will be part of Israel, and we're not building the part that wouldn't be. Fourth, 60.1% of the West Bank is Area C. It's where the Israelis retain civil and security responsibility. The Palestinians have very limited access there. And yet, to give you an example of the significance, not just in terms of landmass, but the economic significance for the Palestinians, all of the rock quarries in the West Bank are in Area C. As you know, one of the bigger industries for Palestinians in the West Bank is stonemasonry, but they don't own any of the rock quarries. So I would say allow Palestinians much greater economic activity in Area C. It doesn't threaten security, but it sends two messages. One, Israel means what it says. When the Prime Minister says, we don't want to rule the Palestinians, we don't want to control the Palestinians, it's a way to signal that it means what you say. And secondly, at a time when the Palestinians economically need much more underpinning to enhance their economic position, this would also be something that would help them economically. Fifth, Area B is 21.7% of the West Bank, proving I haven't spent any time on this issue at all. And, there the Palestinians have civil responsibility and responsibility for law and order, but they don't have responsibility for security against terror. They have a police presence, and I would like to see the police presence, which is already coordinated with the IDF anyway, I'd like to see the police presence built more. Allow it to expand, even allow the role to expand. Again, sends the same message about Palestinians will shape their own future, will have control over their own future. Sixth is Area A. Area A is where the Palestinians have civil and security responsibility. The Israelis still on occasion go back into Area A. They don't go in just to make a point. They go in for security reasons. This is an issue I've actually raised with Prime Minister Fayyad, where I said, would you agree to sit down with the Israelis and see if you can come to an agreement on a set of criteria that if they're met, the Israelis don't come back in from a security standpoint, and if they're not met, they have a justification to come back in. So those are 6 steps for the Israelis. I said there's 14. I have a 7th step, but it's a mutual one, so I want to save it for the Palestinian side. On the Palestinian side, their steps. 1, put Israel on a map. You can't find Israel on a map in any Palestinian textbook or on any Palestinian website. You can find Palestinian maps that show Israeli settlements, but you don't find Israel on a map. So I'd like to see put Israel on a map. Second step, stop the incitement. The idea that when a square is named in a local town, that this is just the local city council that's doing this decision, let the Palestinian Authority send a message. We're not about that. When you name a square for somebody who killed Israelis, we're not going to celebrate that. Third, start talking about 2 states for 2 peoples, and acknowledge that there is a Jewish connection to the land and to Jerusalem. You don't have to go beyond that, but acknowledge that history. It doesn't undercut Palestinian claims or rights, but acknowledges the reality that you recognize the Israeli claims and rights. Fourth, condition your people for peace. And here I'm going to quote Arafat. Arafat used to say to me all the time, I'm not asking for the moon. I'm not asking for the moon here. I'm not asking for the Palestinians to spell out all the concessions they're prepared to make. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking them, take what was the Arafat template, which was peace of the brave. He used to always talk about peace of the brave. And say what peace of the brave means is we both have hard decisions to make. Not only one side, we both have hard decisions to make. The 5th step, about 5 or 6 years ago, Abu Mazen said that, he asked the question, where does it say that Palestinians should live in squalid conditions? And what he was getting at is in the refugee camps. Why shouldn't we rebuild the refugee camps? Now, it didn't actually happen. I'm saying now, you don't have to say anything. Just do it. Start rebuilding the camps in the West Bank. They represent 8% of the population of the West Bank. Start rebuilding them with permanent housing, and also allow those who live within the camps to move out if they want to move out. That's the 5th step. 6th step is something actually Palestinians do for themselves, but it sends a message to Israelis. And that is, continue to build your own state and build the rule of law. In keeping with the demands, look at, the demonstrations that took place about 4 weeks ago. They were over the rise in prices, economics, and corruption. The more the Palestinians do to build the rule of law, the better it is for them, but it sends a message to the Israelis about the kind of state they're going to be. Okay, the 7th step is a mutual step for each side. The only Israelis that Palestinians see are Israeli soldiers. And so it's very easy to dehumanize and demonize when those are the only ones that you see. And obviously the relationship between them and the soldiers is not a perfect relationship, to put it mildly. But on the Israeli side, about 2 months ago, we saw a lynch take place in Jerusalem of a Palestinian. And those who were involved, you look at the Facebook pages, they said really awful things. Now, the Israeli government, from every leader, condemned what happened. But what you have is Israelis never see Palestinians at all, basically. And what I would like to do is I would like to see, starting at the 3rd or 4th grade, I'd like to see an exchange of classrooms or exchange of kids. Not bringing people here, there. I want kids to start seeing each other because they actually will see each other as people. And if we're going to change the dynamic, that is a dynamic of disbelief about each side's commitment to 2 states, this is where you start. Now, as I said, if the 2 of them sit down and this is an agenda for them, they can have other ideas. But if they were to say, all right, if you take that step, we'll take this step, then you begin to create a virtuous cycle. And that can change the dynamic. Anyone, as I said, who thinks that you're going to go ahead at this point and suddenly you're going to create an outcome when there's complete disbelief on the part of both publics. And you see it, by the way, in what's happening to the polling. The polling, up until about a year ago, still showed very strong majorities on each side in favor of 2 states, but also at the same time not believing that it would take place. Now those numbers are dropping on each side, and that is symptomatic of the disbelief. And political leaders who are operating in a context of disbelief are unlikely to take big dramatic steps for peace. And anybody who thinks that you're going to create it in that environment is kidding themselves.
Yeah. In the far back, yes.
Sorry, Dennis, to make you sit down. Elise Labott, I just wanted to follow up on what you were saying, because it seems to me like this 14-point plan, obviously you've had these ideas for a while, could form the basis for some kind of U.S. presentation of a possible steps and ultimately leading to a deal. And I'm just, between you and Ambassador Jeffrey, the Middle East peace process, obviously, while important, doesn't seem to be, exactly the first priority when you look at what is going on in the Middle East right now. And I'm wondering if that's because there's fatigue, if it's because we have so many more pressing interests between Iran, Syria, and the growing Islamic threat, or is it because that the parties are not ready for a deal? I mean, what is really holding this up, considering on the second day of President Obama's first term, he pledged to make this a priority? Thank you.
Well, I think that, obviously an effort was made and it didn't materialize. But then it did get swamped by a lot of other things. I mean, what is one of the most frustrating realities for Palestinians today? That no one is paying attention to them. It's not just, look in the region itself. The Gulf states are focused on Iran, on Syria, primarily. The emergence of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they're focused, whatever they say, they're focused primarily domestically. So you have all these other issues. You have the Arab awakening. You have this, this powerful new reality that is unfolding in the region, but nobody knows exactly what it's going to mean. And it's consumed everybody's attention. But, the reason I obviously have been thinking about this is because the issue is not going away. We have an interest in not just letting it reach the point where the disbelief becomes so powerful that it becomes difficult to do anything at all. And I think there are huge challenges throughout the region, but I think it's a mistake to lose sight of this one.
Dr. Kumar, on my left.
Thank you so much to the panel for an excellent presentation, both ambassadors and Dr. Satloff. I have essentially two questions. Firstly, with regard to the conflation of the death of bin Laden with the death of al-Qaeda and what we've seen in Libya plus or through Mali, North Africa, AQAP, and so on and so forth. When will this realization really sink in, and when will these pronouncements be made that we still have a war to fight with al-Qaeda? That is one question. Secondly, the cozying up of the Muslim Brotherhood-dominated government in Egypt with the U.S., what implications does it have for our relationship with Israel and for allaying Israeli concerns that the bilateral relationship of Egypt with the U.S. will not impact the U.S.-Israeli relationship, which I think is the most important relationship in the region? Thank you.
Jim, you want to talk about that?
I'll try the first one. There's no doubt that al-Qaeda is much more on the ropes now than it was 5 or 10 years ago. This has been a success of both the Bush and the Obama administrations. The death of bin Laden was the logical conclusion of a campaign that began almost a decade ago of targeting senior leaders. The Bush administration got Zarqawi in Diyala province in Iraq in 2006, I think, and then bin Laden and many of the other leaders have been, basically the movement has been decapitated. The problem is that the movement has morphed in a different direction. Probably it is nowhere near as dangerous to us now as it was then. But as we have seen in Yemen, in some of these areas, these ungoverned areas where it can set up a presence, people come in that case from America, and they direct its threats not just to the local government, although that's certainly one of the problems, nor to the Shia sect, but also to get on airplanes and kill Americans here in the homeland. So therefore, there's still a direct threat. It's not the same level as we were on or right after 9/11, but it still is something we have to watch for. But secondly, at the same time, it is a threat to the region, as it always was, but in particular, it is a threat to the Shia-Sunni divide that can tear the region asunder and give it a real role, and this is what we don't want. This is a movement that morphs. This is a region that keeps looking for some kind of cause that it can attach itself to allow its very extreme form of Sunni Islam, combined with violence, to capture the masses, to capture territorial space. And that's what we have to watch against. I think we've got a good set of policies against it. The problem is those policies themselves are controversial because they require using a mix of, from a legal standpoint and to some degree, drones in the air, F-16s and such military means, against a problem that also involves criminal activities. And normally there is a division in a rule of law state between the two. The problem with illegal enemy combatants, of which terrorists from al-Qaeda are a subset, is exactly that there is a blurred line between the two. Therefore, we can't change that line. We can't really change fundamentally our policies. We have to explain why we have to lock these people up. Guantanamo, both Presidents Bush and President Obama wanted to close it, but that was for, frankly, propaganda purposes because we were getting a black eye. We were getting a black eye because people didn't understand the problem. That's like a POW camp. In addition, many of those people also can be tried legally, either in a military commissions or in a U.S. court, and both have been tried. Those are very important distinctions, but nonetheless, we have to explain a very complicated issue to the American people and to our allies around the world. If we can do so, we can continue these sophisticated but somewhat controversial tactics, working with our allies to keep the organization under pressure. If we find that our basic tools are being eroded because of concerns, because of diplomatic pressure and such, these guys are going to sprout up all over the place. Thank you.
Look, there's no doubt that the government of Israel is concerned about developments in Egypt. I think if you look at the events of the last several months, they've seen everything going on in the region, and they've decided to try to keep their powder dry about certain things that the government of Egypt has done or not done vis-a-vis Israel and the Egypt-Israel peace treaty, because it knows that there are even more urgent issues, and it doesn't want to distract attention from those issues to their concern about Egypt. But Israel is quite concerned about developments in Egypt. Point one. Point two, there is an assessment that for the foreseeable future, the Islamist government of Egypt is here to stay. And so one can't merely wish away the existence of this government. And President Morsi showed rather impressive degree of bureaucratic and political agility in putting his own people in place in the military leadership when that change came in August. Now, there was deep concern inside Israel, not just because of the change and the removal of people who had a relationship with Israel, but for about 10 days, Israelis had no one to talk to. The only channels that exists today between Egypt and Israel are the military and intelligence channels. And for 10 days, as this was being sorted out, the Israelis had no one to call. And that in and of itself was a huge red warning sign going off. Now, all this being said, it really does come down to this fundamental question of whether, not whether the Egyptian leadership is going to give up its ideology, but whether the objective of political success will trump the objective of ideological purity. And what is political success? Political success is making sure you're not having a war on your borders. Political success is making sure the international community sends billions of FDI. Political success is making sure the people see results for their elections. Political success is making sure that Hamas in Gaza does not govern the relationship with Egypt, but that Egypt governs the relationship with Hamas. If this is the route that the government of Egypt pursues, then the potential for a working relationship with Israel is possible. If it tries to achieve political success via ideological means, then we in the United States will be in a very difficult position, and the Israelis will be in an even more difficult position. One last note is that we're about to see the completion of the security fence. I say security fence, people think of what's going up between the West Bank or part of the West Bank and pre-67 Israel. That security fence isn't going to be complete for a long, long time. It's all mired in politics, et cetera, et cetera. The security fence I'm talking about is the one along the Egypt-Israel border, which has unanimous support among the Israeli political system and has gone up with lightning speed. That is almost completed and is likely to have a very powerful impact on the potential for terrorism emanating from inside Egypt into Israel. This sir over here, you had a question earlier. No? Okay, Howard.
Howard Sumka. 10 years ago, we were frantically trying to buy up Stinger missiles in Bosnia, which had probably gotten there from Afghanistan. The question I have is, if we do consider lethal support to the Syrian freedom fighters, or whatever we call them, how do we manage, especially when we have no presence at all, how do we manage to control where those go and how they might get used in the future?
When I made a reference to seeing the need to provide lethal assistance, I said that. I didn't say Stinger missiles. I didn't say man-pads. It seems to me one of the things we have to do is we have to not just identify but test those who we'd be prepared to support. You know, it shouldn't be an insuperable task, and by that I mean, you know, who is prepared to make what promises? Who lives up to the promises they make? Do they keep an inventory of what we provide them? We can create an accountability. If they can't account for what we provide them, then obviously don't keep providing it to them. So I wouldn't start by providing them man-pads, but I would be prepared to provide them, you know, anti-tank missiles. You know, by the way, if one of the things is if they had anti-tank missiles, they'd probably find it a lot easier to take over some of the air bases. In which case, that would be another way to prevent, you know, having to contend with the air power. But I also think these new ways of looking at how you could do no-fly without actually having to operate over Syrian airspace, it's also worth looking at. But I think there's a way to, I mean, obviously there's been a process underway now, but I think we can identify those who are prepared to make certain kinds of commitments. We can see how well they live up to their commitments. We can create our own measures of what they have to do, and what we provide them is going to be a function of their responsiveness and their delivery.
If I could jump in on that for just a second. The asterisk I would put where the drafter of Rob Satloff's report to the President would pick up on this point and say, also picking up on Dennis's risk and opportunity are two sides of the same coin. There's always going to be downsides to any course of action you take. And being in government, boy, you get them thrown at you because if there's one thing the bureaucracy can churn out, it's why not to do something. But I'll take on two of the biggest downsides and ask you a question. As one who flies around in airplanes, we don't like to have stingers out there, and a lot of bad things came from Afghanistan post-1989. But the Soviet Union was driven out, and that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that has changed the entire world and liberated hundreds of millions of people. With Iraq, a little bit more complicated, but nonetheless, we have, as Rob said, and as I alluded to, we have a democratic country in the middle, very core of the Middle East, no longer exporting missile attacks, invasions, and general insecurity to the entire region. Now the #2 OPEC oil exporter. Sure, bad things happen because we didn't get things right in 2003, but does that mean going in 2003, whatever we discuss it was such a bad thing? So that's what any policymaker has to look at. There's an upside as well as a downside to everything.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am, right here, and then Maury, and then I'm going to have to close.
Thank you very much. This is, my name is Rita Ragsdale. I'm from the Department of State, and this is for Ambassador Jeffrey, and he was relating to what he just talked about and what also Ambassador Ross was talking about, and that is Syria, because Ambassador Jeffrey was advocating that the U.S. intervene militarily in Syria. And I'm thinking now, in this new administration, there is really no appetite on the part of the American people for possibly another war. But if we did get involved militarily, how do we decide who to support? This looks like, to me, a hydra-headed monster in which new heads are being eaten up by other heads among these opposition leaders, put those in quote. How do we decide who to support in this and be on the right side? Thank you.
How you doing, Rita? It's good to see you again. Thanks for the question, which is a tough one to answer. Again, you're right about the American people, but we need to look at this, because I've been through this now twice in the 40 years I've been in government, after Vietnam and now after the adventures of the first decade of this century. And I would make a distinction, and I think there was a Pew poll the other day that made that distinction. When given the choice between dealing powerfully with Iran's nuclear threat or avoiding at all costs military action, the American people in October went from, I think, 50 or 51 to 56% to take action, and from avoid military from 46 to roughly 40%. So thus the spread opened from 6 to 12%. What's going on here? I would submit, and I think this was a mistake we made in Libya to some degree, although it at least turned out halfway well. What the American people don't want is hundreds of thousands of ground troops committed to a nation-building with shooting exercise with no exit strategy, and with the argument being we have to be here until they kind of look like Norway and resolve their problems. And I'm with the American people on that one. But every day, the American people, through their elected leadership, are conducting a war, as we said, against al-Qaeda, and we don't hear, other than people who are concerned about some of the legal things on the policy margins of this, any complaint from the American people. I'm not advocating ground troops. I'm not advocating getting in there. I'm advocating delivering weapons and delivering one or another form of air power or other military power that can be done offside to let the ground troops, who are the insurgents, do the fighting. That's what we did in Bosnia successfully in 96, 95 rather. That's what we did successfully in Kosovo in 99. That's a model that works. It's what we did in Afghanistan in the 1980s. In all of those places, you're dealing with people that are unpleasant, and if anybody says, I can pick the ones, to quote Governor Romney, who share our values, or I can pick the ones who don't, forget it. It's going to be confusing. We're going to make mistakes. But at the end of the day, do you want to see Iran scoring a huge victory? Do you want to see Assad in power? And do you want to see much of Syria turned into another big Fallujah? I don't. There's no other way than America playing a more active role, period.
Maury, very briefly.
In Syria,
Go ahead.
with regard to Iran, everyone seems to be relying on ratcheting up sanctions, but Congress has been ahead of the administration on sanctions continuously. There have been at least 11 waivers given to importers. We're still not going after the central bank of Iran. So is the administration really going to be serious about making sanctions really hurt? Because they're dealing with a regime which I don't think cares that much about how the people will be feeling.
The administration was given the right to waive sanctions on countries, actually there's sanctions on banks specifically, if those countries reduce significantly their oil imports from Iran. Because of those sanctions specifically, and the fact the administration had, thanks to the Congress giving it to the administration, that flexibility, Iran's exports have dropped from well over 2.2 or 2.4 million barrels a day to less than 800, or roughly 800,000 barrels. That is a huge success, and it's a success because the administration was given the tools to deal in this real world. And so I think that That's okay, and I think that the administration has used it effectively. In terms of the central bank is sanctioned. Any dealings with the central bank on oil trade or on a variety of other trade can lead to sanctions, absolutely.
Very good. Dennis, Jim, thank you very much. Friends, as I said, we'll be back again before long talking about more specific issues in the transition. Thank you for joining us for today's event.